Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, September 8th, 2025, and today we are going to be taking a look at the race to the White House forecast for the 2026 governor elections, which also include the 2025 races in New Jersey and Virginia. Now, the reason why I'm making this video, I think, is no secret that it is always interesting to look at forecasts for elections because oftentimes they get us a better understanding as to what the odds look like in individual races and who is most likely and least likely to win individual governor races. And given that the election is roughly a year out, I felt it was necessary to look at some of these forecasts yesterday and today. If you haven't checked out my Senate election forecast analysis of what we see here on racetothewhitehouse.com, I implore you to go ahead and check that out yesterday. But today we're looking at the governor elections, which arguably are some of the most interesting that we will see this cycle. I talk about this a lot, and if you're tired of me hearing it, you may want to skip ahead about 30 seconds. But ultimately, I find these governor races to be some of the most rewarding to watch, the most interesting, because a lot of these states are really dynamic in how they vote, and oftentimes do vote differently than how they do on the presidential level or the congressional level or whatever it might be. A lot of these races, in terms of how people vote for governor, is largely dependent on what they want to see strictly contained to their state boundaries. So sometimes you'll see that there are Democratic governors in red states. Right now, there's a Democratic governor in Kentucky, in Kansas. There are Republican governors in states like Vermont and neighboring New Hampshire. And so there's a lot that really does get unpacked and discussed in these election forecasts that might otherwise be completely glossed over in traditional election discussion. And that's why I find them to be so interesting. Now, there's a lot of information here. My focus is going to be what the map looks like and what the balance of power looks like after that. Obviously, governor elections don't have the same political weight as the Senate elections or House elections in terms of a national party composition, but as it stands in terms of who has more seats is still very interesting to track. We look at it at its baseline. Democrats are projected to win about 24 seats in the next governor elections. Republicans expected to have about 26. Now, in years past, Republicans have been dominating the governor elections on the overall net. In 2014, Republicans held 31 seats of the governor races, and Democrats held just 18. A year later, Democrats didn't see much movement, and a year after that, the numbers got worse. Republicans expanded, then we saw Jim Justice switch political parties from Democrat to Republican, ultimately making it so 2/3 of all governorships across the country were held by Republicans. Then in 2017, Democrats flipped New Jersey. Then in 2018, Democrats made massive gains all the way up to 23 seats. Throughout the remainder of the next few years, it took until 2022 when Democrats got back to that point of roughly 24 seats. Now, looking at the forecast here, that's roughly exactly what is expected of them in 2026, and I'm very interested to see exactly what this looks like. Now, as was standard with my Senate election forecast analysis video yesterday, we translated this to a yapms.com map where we looked at what it looked like visually speaking. And we used the same characterizations that we used for my video where we discussed the political betting markets. And as we've done and as we've used for the past, nearly decade, which is crazy to think about on our maps here in relation to an election forecast. So the headlines. Democrats, 24 seats. Republicans, 26 on the overall net. But again, not every single seat is up on the governor elections, and we know that because they don't hold elections every single year. The majority of them are held in years like 2022, 2018, and of course, 2026. But as the title had suggested when we looked at the forecast discussing 2025 races, there are a lot of races that are far and in between, and you'll find them. In 2021, there were races in Virginia and New Jersey. There was a recall election in California that Gavin Newsom blew out of the water. In 2023, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And in 2024, North Carolina, Delaware, Vermont, New Hampshire, West Virginia, Indiana, Missouri, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, and Washington. Sounds like a lot, but in reality, the overwhelming majority of them, roughly 2/3 of them, if not more, actually, I think about 75%, are in the 2026 midterms and will be up on that 4-year rotational cycle. So here's the map. Democrats, Republicans have their respective strongholds. A lot of these seats are actually quite competitive, believe it or not. Again, despite them might not necessarily being that competitive on the presidential level. States like Alaska are considered to be a toss-up. States like Iowa are considered to be a toss-up. 2 states that Donald Trump won by 13 and 13 points in both of these states in the last cycle are now toss-ups in the 2026 race. Very interesting, if you ask me. And looking across the map here, we're going to go ahead and start off by characterizing all of the states that are considered to be safe for the GOP, which are quite a few. Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Nebraska, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Alabama. And there's a few more, but we'll get to them in a moment. What I found to be interesting, though, is that looking at years past, I love talking about the competitive nature of many of these races because they are way more competitive than you think. But I remember back in 2018, it wasn't too far ago that South Dakota, Kristi Noem, who's now in one of Trump's secretaries in the cabinet, won her race by just 3.4% against Billy Sutton in 2018. So that race actually has been arguably quite competitive. In 2022, Oklahoma was a 14-point race, despite being a 30-point race on the presidential level. If that was a swing state, Democrats would have won it in a landslide in 2022. So a lot of interesting things that this time around, unfortunately, just for the nature of loving the sport of competitive elections, looking at it right now, Republicans have a pretty locked in and safe expectation in those states. So Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Alabama. But it doesn't really end there. These are the states that have roughly, 95.5% or higher chance of victory. But the way we typically do this is by characterizing the states where the chance of victory that is 90.1% plus, we consider to be safe. Now, there have been times where the, governor elections were more lopsided in favor of the GOP and are no longer. And a lot of this has to do with the candidates that are running and just the general expectations around 2026 getting bluer and bluer. Now, Democrats have their own states as ones that are considered to be safe. And of course, we're going to go ahead and characterize those. They aren't as many as there are on the Republican side. But taking a look at the map here, it's pretty easy to see that a lot of these races that may not be considered quote-unquote safe for the next cycle are very locked in and solid for the Democratic Party. Massachusetts is safe for the Democrats. Maryland is safe for the Democrats. Illinois, California, which this is a race we don't know who's going to be governor. There's no incumbent, but certainly going to be safe for the Democrats. Hawaii is the same way. These are states that we can characterize at baseline are going to be considered safe for the Democrats. It doesn't seem like many, but there are a few more. States like Connecticut are 91%. Rhode Island is 93%. The state of Minnesota is 90%. We'll keep that because it's right on that cusp of being, a safe state. We'll keep it as safe just because they're off by 0.1%. And I think on the margins here, it simply just doesn't make sense to go ahead and scrutinize to that degree. If it was, 88% or 89%, I think it would. But this is, again, there's very, very, could go either way. I think it's easier to say at the end of the day that you're closer to that higher end part. Let's see. Colorado, Michael Bennet. Yes, that is the Senator Michael Bennet. He's leaving the United States Senate to run for governor. If he is elected, he will appoint his successor, and that will prompt a special election in Colorado worth looking at. But a lot, that has to happen first in order to that be the case. In Oregon, another state that Democrats traditionally had actually had very competitive races in, that in 2022 was won by 3.4%. In 2018, believe it or not, was won by just 6%. This time around, the expectations in Oregon are that Democrats win it by 12. Okay, we're spending a lot of time talking about a lot of these safer races here. Not much focus necessary on the races because these are the ones that are arguably some of the more, less competitive. But let's talk about the rest. We are working with a wide map here. 17 toss-up seats ranging all the way from Alaska to Maine. You are talking coast to coast, and it is interesting because Democrats and Republicans truly do have fighting chances in a lot of these states. Some more than others, and we'll focus on the ones briefly that aren't really going to be that much of primary targets for either political party, but still are interesting to track. These are states like South Carolina, which are likely red, Texas, which is likely red, based on the predictions here, and that makes a lot of sense. Greg Abbott's going to run for re-election. He'll probably win by less than he did in 2022, but still win. South Carolina, we will see. This is a very competitive race, by the way, on the Republican side, not as much on the Democratic side. We'll see who wins that nomination because if it is one of the more extreme candidates here in a race like South Carolina, believe it or not, it could narrow up. Democrats won't win it, but it is a race worth looking at. Vermont, likely for the GOP. I'd argue, too, some of these other races, I don't really fully agree with the characterization in terms of Republicans being in the advantage. I do agree that they're in the advantage to the degree that they are. I don't know if I necessarily find myself agreeing with it fully. I think Florida, we're much closer to a 90% chance personally. But, again, I'm not here to argue with the forecast I'm just here to show it to you. So South Carolina, Texas, Vermont, all states that reign in as likely for the Republican Party. Let's go ahead and continue, because there are quite a few states that we can consider to be likely for the Democrats. And so these are states, again, that are 75% plus. It's not going to be in the state of New Mexico, but you're going to find it in Virginia. You're going to find it in New Jersey, which I guess aren't on this map here, but assume those are two for the Democratic Party. Maine is not going to find itself there. I think we're pretty limited in terms of states, meaning the rest are going and set to be quite competitive. I think that Pennsylvania, actually, I don't know why I completely glossed over that one. That one is considered safe by the forecast there, which is a huge one. Trump state, 2016 and 2024, Josh Shapiro on track for a pretty solid victory. So 13 remaining races here. They actually are, going to be very, very heavily targeted. There's a lot and wide expectation that in Alaska, Mary Peltola might run for governor. If she does not, Tom Begich is still a strong candidate there. A traditional race that you would expect to be, more on the edge of being, right now at least, more on the edge of being closer to Trump and closer to Republicans. We're not finding that, and we're not finding it in a lot of these races. On the outside, though, you're finding that states like Ohio are still leaning towards the Republican Party. States like Florida are still leaning towards the Republican Party. These are races that, right now we'd say Republicans have the upper hand. In many of these races, you're going to find that the GOP does find itself pulling ahead in states like Kansas. They have, an expectation. They have a 74.8% chance of winning that race, right? In Iowa, another race that is a toss-up, but Republicans have a 58% chance of winning that race. That's also within our lean characterization in the state. So that's bringing Republicans up to 15. They've already flipped Kansas, by the way, which right now is held by Democrats. Of course, Democrats, can hold off their own in states like New Mexico. They have a 70% chance of winning in Arizona. We're finding that on the map there. Katie Hobbs is expected to do quite well against Andy Biggs, which I don't entirely disagree with. Deb Holland, I think her chances are far higher than 74%, but again, that's yet to be seen. In Kansas, too, I think we'll see, depending on how this general election shakes up. For now, Republicans have the advantage. In Iowa, a very competitive race, but I do agree Republicans have that slight advantage. In New Hampshire, Kelly Ayotte has a 65% chance of winning. I also agree with that. She's popular. Voters like her. She'll probably win by a pretty good amount. Not going to be Sununu numbers at all, but it's going to be, pretty okay for them. The interesting thing about the remainder of these seats here, this state of Nevada also stands to be a lean Republican seat. The remainder, are going to be quite interesting. Now, Maine is tilted towards the Democrats. That makes sense. Angus King's son, yes, Angus King, the senator, his son right now is presumably the front runner on the Democratic side for governor. But of course, that can shake up. It's actually quite a competitive Democratic primary. At the end of the day, though, Democrats are more likely than not going to win the governorship in Maine. In Nevada, though, it is interesting because right now the expectation is Aaron Ford, the attorney general, and Joe Lombardo, the incumbent governor. But Lombardo's popular. And not to mention, he's a Republican who is tempered by Democrats who have a supermajority in the state legislature. So it is often hard to pass pieces of legislation and do things that are unpopular when you have a 67 to 70% Democratic legislature saying, absolutely not. And although Trump won this state, Democrats have truly drew the map in a way that benefits them a lot in Nevada, and it has maintained their majority that gives them full governing control. Joe Lombardo can't even veto bills that the Democratic legislature passes. And so thinking about that in context, it is difficult for a Republican to be unpopular when being held back for some of the more unpopular views by Democrats and vice versa. We've seen it time and time again, and it helps them maintain this level of popularity that helps them win even in Democratic wave years. Now, don't count out Aaron Ford, but I actually do agree with the characterization right now that Republicans have the upper hand. For the final two states, four states, jumping around here, Georgia, Alaska, Wisconsin, and Michigan, they stand to be some of the most competitive on the map here. Now, I don't necessarily think Wisconsin is going to be all that competitive. Sarah Rodriguez right now, who is the incumbent lieutenant governor, is likely going to win that Democratic nomination for governor. She'll probably win that race. But Michigan, Georgia, and Alaska have been really perplexing. And the big reason for Alaska being perplexing is simply on the fact that it is a Trump double-digit state that is very competitive this cycle. And Democrats could find themselves with a shocking victory by the end of the next midterms. But Republicans still have about a 58% chance of winning there. Now, that's with Nancy Dahlstrom, who right now doesn't seem to be the presumptive Republican nominee, but she's extreme. She has a track record that reminds me a lot of the way Sarah Palin ran her failed congressional bids in August of 2022 and November of 2022. And if that is what pans to reality, especially with the Peltola, Senate bid driving up Democratic support just across the tickets here, Alaska could be one of those sleeper states that Democrats, believe it or not, might be able to pull through, because Democrats have done it in states like Alaska before. And I know it sounds crazy to think about. This is a state that McCain won by 26 because Palin was so popular. But oftentimes, Republicans in some of these states go too far. And in Alaska so far, that is what the expectation has been largely driving a lot of these numbers down. Now, for the case of Michigan and Georgia, Michigan I will cover last because that is an interesting three-way race. But in Georgia, the projection here is that Democrats actually win it by a tilt margin, win it by a very narrow amount. Now, I actually have had in every one of my predictions Republicans ahead in Georgia. But I think we're getting closer and closer to the set of circumstances that sets Democrats up for victory in this state. The trend lines are moving in the right way for Democrats on the overall net. Even though Trump won the state in 2024, it was by 3 points less than 2016, the only state to swing by that much to the left relative to Trump's first election in terms of battleground states. Georgia is a state that even if the national environment is swinging by 3 points, I can find Republicans maybe winning the governorship, and I think right now they are the favorites. But I think it's no shock that when it comes down to a swing back and forth, Georgia right now, my last prediction, lean Republican, if not tilt Republican, tilt Democrat isn't too far off. So Keisha Lance Bottoms, right now the Democratic, front runner for governor here, looks like she is going to win, at least according to Race to the White House. So the final race here is Michigan, which has a multi-way race between Jocelyn Benson, the Democratic Secretary of State, who right now is the Democratic frontrunner, also running against the incumbent Lieutenant Governor, Garland Gilchrist. An interesting race, but nonetheless one that Jocelyn Benson maintains frontrunner status. John James, a U.S. representative, I believe Michigan's 11th district. I might be a little bit off about that. Either way, he's a name that has run statewide. He ran in 2018 against Debbie Stabenow, ran in 2020 against Gary Peters, then ran for Congress in 22, re-elected in 24, now running for governor. But the third candidate is independent former Democratic mayor and incumbent mayor Mike Duggan from Detroit, a huge vote sink for the Democratic Party in 2024 and every election. Without it, Democrats don't have a super clear pathway to victory. Now, there are ways for Democrats to win. In 2018 and 2022, if you removed the city of Detroit from the vote count for Gretchen Whitmer, she still would have won her governor elections. And so that's not to say that, Detroit is inconsequential. It matters a lot, especially when Michigan, like we saw in the last election, was decided by thousands of votes. But when it comes down to 2026, there is a pathway if Democrats do have this massive overperformance relative to previous election cycles that would do them in a red year, in a mediocre year. But right now, Jocelyn Benson has a 58% chance of victory, which puts it right there in the lean Democratic column. And so that finalizes our map. Republicans at 18, Democrats at 18. Democrats win Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia, all states that Donald Trump won in the last election. But Republicans hold on to their seats in Alaska, Nevada, Iowa, Ohio, Florida, New Hampshire, Vermont, and they flip Kansas from the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, Democrats are flipping Georgia. The rest of the states stay the same. 18 to 18, and that's the map here. Democrats and Republicans roughly equal. When it comes down to the 2026 elections, Republicans on the overall net have the upper hand, but Democrats hold their own, and overall, no net change on this gubernatorial map. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 governor election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.